Very good evening to all of you from India. Good morning to our viewers in the United States. My name is Raj Kumar. I'm the founding Vice Chancellor of Jindal Global University. I have great pleasure in extending a warm welcome to all of you to the fourth day of the World University Summit hosted by the Jindal Global Center for G20 Studies and the International Institute for Higher Education Research and Capacity Building at OP Jindal Global University. I would like to extend a warm welcome to this special thematic session and fireside chat on the theme, Building World-Class Universities, the American Imagination for Higher Education. I have with me two distinguished educators who have spent a lifetime in some of the world's leading universities, both as a student and later as an academic, and their own journeys and life stories are indeed going to inform the thematic focus of this discussion. I have with us Professor Peter Schuck from Yale University and Dr. Geoffrey Cox from Stanford University. Let me quickly introduce Professor Schuck. Professor Schuck is an Emeritus Professor of Law at Yale University, where he has held the Simeon Baldwin Professorship since 1984. He is a contributing editor to the American Lawyer, has served as an arbitrator, expert witness, and consultant in a variety of disputes, and has testified in dozens of congressional hearings. He is an accomplished scholar who has written extensively on law and public policy. He has been working on tort law, immigration, citizenship, and refugee law, issues surrounding groups, diversity and law, and also administrative law. He was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2015. Earlier, he was awarded a Harvard Graduate Prize Fellowship, a Guggenheim Fellowship, a residency scholar at the Rockefeller Foundation Center in Bellagio, and a Fulbright Senior Fellow Scholar in India. He practiced law in New York City and holds degrees from Cornell University, Harvard University, New York University, and also has been a professor at NYU and Berkeley, besides being at Yale. The second person I want to introduce is Dr. Geoffrey Cox, who's a Senior Associate Dean for Administration in the Graduate School of Education at Stanford University. Dr. Cox is also a lecturer and program director of a joint MA Education and MBA program. His interests are in the philosophy of education, the ethics of educational technology, and in educational governance and management. Previously, he served as president of Alliant International University and has also held positions as vice provost at Stanford and as assistant provost and budget director at the University of Chicago. He's also served as a commissioner for regional accreditation as a member of the Western Senior College and University Commission. He's the author of Theorizing the Resilience of American Higher Education, an exploration of how colleges and universities adapt to social, economic, and technological change. He holds a PhD in philosophy from the University of Chicago. With those words, the format of the session is going to be that I'm going to invite both Peter and Jeff to make some introductory remarks, and then we will have a fireside chat, a question and answer session with me. And towards the end of this program, I will take some questions from the audience. I will collect it and share it with our guests here. So with those words, may I invite Professor Peter Schuck to share his introductory remarks. Over to you, Peter.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kumar, and my greetings to the wonderful audience that you've assembled for this marvelous summit session. My main comments will have to do with the nature of the American experience in developing higher education institutions of distinction and of prominence. It didn't start out that way. At the very beginning, the development of educational institutions at the university level was very low key. It was low visibility. It was local, highly local, but it started very, very early. In the case of Harvard College, it was 1636. That was only a brief period of time after the Pilgrims initially came to Massachusetts Bay, and one of the first things that they did was to establish educational institutions, and in particular a college level, which was modeled on the institutions to which they were accustomed from their lives in Europe. This was particularly true in the case of the institutions that were first established in the United States, which were modeled on congregational church models that were entirely devoted toward training the ministry of the new land that they were creating. And this was true of Yale as well in 1701, also establishing a university which would be a college first and then ultimately a university, which would train ministers to propagate the religion in the new colonies. There was, I should say, just parenthetically, that there was competition between Harvard and Yale from the very, very beginning. It didn't begin with the football and rugby competition. There were religious differences in the constitution of the two schools. And then, of course, there were many other, in the other colonies, there were many other institutions that were established at a very early time. They were very small, of course, and they were modeled on the British systems and on Scottish universities, and they were each quite distinctive in their own outlooks and in their own religious orientations. The purpose of these colleges and institutions was to train young men for the Protestant ministry. Women were not accepted in U.S. campuses until the mid-1800s. And even then it was very sporadic and incomplete until well into the 20th century. One feature of American educational institutions was the role of benefactors. The government played a very limited role. Indeed, sometimes the government, the state government, or the colonial government at the outset had some competing interests that countered the interests of the philanthropists, the private donors who established these institutions and put them on a financial footing. As I'm sure Jeff will discuss in the case of Stanford, Leland Stanford, who was a great industrialist and extraordinarily successful entrepreneur, established the campus there. And similarly, other institutions were established by private donors. The institutions were small, and in addition to their ministry and focus on religious vocations, there was also very early on an interest in educating the common yeoman in industrial arts and agricultural methods. In my own institution, collegiate institution, Cornell University, it was established in 1862, and it was designed as what is called a land grant college, in which the state, pursuant to a federal innovation that Abraham Lincoln, as president, established, was designed to educate farmers and mechanics and tradespeople and others of very modest professional or occupational status in the ways in which would improve their status in life. And those land grant institutions, which were established in many states, maybe all states, I'm really not sure, by the late 19th century, were very, very important in the diffusion of scientific and technical and occupational skills in the various states in which they were established. An interesting footnote to this was that in 1890, Congress established something called the Black Land Grant College system, which was designed to be segregated by race and was limited to Black people who could not attend the land grant institutions that had been established earlier on. As this was occurring, there was an enormous number of Protestant denominations that established small colleges in virtually every state, which many of which continue today, so that we have an extraordinarily fragmented, decentralized system of higher education. And the prominence of Yale and Harvard and Stanford and institutions of that sort should not obscure the fact that a vast number of American students study at much smaller institutions, which have relatively little to do with government support, that are primarily institutions of teaching and only modestly involved in research or technological development. Another remarkable feature of American education, and it has an interesting relationship to the question of excellence, excellence in institutions, is that we never established a national university. George Washington initially had proposed a national university in what came to be the District of Columbia, but it was opposed by the states and it never was established. And so we have an extraordinarily fragmented, decentralized system with no centralized university leadership at all. I'll just, my time is running out, so just let me mention a couple of themes that we may return to later. One has to do with the strong influence of German research universities in the development of the research institutions in the United States, such as Stanford and Harvard and Yale, and the professionalization of the teaching profession during this period really reflected the German influence to a very great extent. There have been a series of crises that have afflicted higher education in the United States. The Depression was, of course, a financial calamity for everybody, including universities. But there was also political struggle in connection with universities, such as during the McCarthy era, during the early 1950s, late 1940s and early 1950s. There was a great deal of intimidation by politicians of the leadership of certain prominent universities, including Harvard and Yale, and a great emphasis on the importance of uniformity. I would say today, just in conclusion, I would say today we are facing a new crisis, which goes under a variety of different appellations, one of which is wokeism, in which major universities are being accused of having favored certain types of student ideologies, student-led ideologies, to the detriment of their teaching responsibilities and the pursuit of truth in connection with their research and their teaching. But the final comment I would make is that the great strengths of American universities, and especially at the world-class level, has been their decentralization, their academic freedom, and the role of alumni who are extraordinarily generous and active in not just the creation of these institutions, but in their sustaining work. And this is probably not true in any other country, at least not to the same extent. So that's part of the decentralization, part of the privatization, and part of the professionalization that has marked American higher education from the very beginning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter, for that very comprehensive tour de force on the history and evolution of the American imagination for higher education universities. I also appreciate the fact that you brought in some important unique features of the American higher education system and how it was able to sustain so many truly world-class universities for such a long time. We will come back to those issues a little later. Now let me invite Dr. Cox to share his introductory remarks. Over to you, Dr. Cox.
Thank you so much, Raj. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm honored to share the platform with such a distinguished panel. And I'll make a few brief remarks that very much echo things that Peter has said. I think that the history that he's given us, to anyone who has looked into the history of American higher education, many of those elements are familiar and very important. I mean, I think he did a great job of outlining some of the most salient features of our somewhat chaotic growth over the last, 4 centuries. I really became interested in sort of the diversity of the current higher education landscape when I was serving as Raj mentioned this in my introduction. We have a system of accreditation in the United States that is also quite decentralized. It is a regional system. So there are 6 accrediting bodies with territorial oversight for different colleges and universities. I served on the one that primarily focuses on California and Hawaii. But one of the things that began to sort of interest me was how all of these different kinds of institutions managed to coexist and survive and in fact cooperate to a considerable extent with such different histories and different purposes. And that led me into a sort of exploration of the dynamics of that diversity, not just to sort of recognize that it exists, which is obvious, but to begin to ask questions about why it has evolved in this way. And indeed to sort of take an ecological approach to this and ask what forces led to the creation of different kinds of institutions and how they managed to survive. I wound up coming up with a thesis, which is the subject of the book that Raj mentioned, which goes roughly like this. I'll give you a very short version of it, but particularly since the mid-1800s, roughly every generation or so, higher education has been asked to do something new by society, and I'll say a bit more about that, but essentially to adopt a new kind of academic mission. It has discovered new organizational models to accommodate that mission, and it has discovered new ways of financing it. So those 3 elements to me are critical in the story. So let me illustrate that with a couple of examples. So the first one, most obvious, is in the 1860s. Peter mentioned this, when the United States established the land-grant institutions. And the new mission that they were asked to take on was to support what were at the time called the manual arts, the practical arts, as opposed to the liberal arts. So as the country was growing, it needed institutions that could support agricultural research and engineering and things like that, which simply were not subjects that were recognized in the traditional universities. So this was a new academic mission. It was financed by the sale of land that the federal government transferred to the states. And the organization was quite different. This was the first time that you had institutions that were divided up into distinct schools rather than just being a college with a common faculty. These were also institutions that were deliberately built for scale. in a way that no institution had ever imagined prior to that. Institutions that were designed to serve an entire state's population. And even though they started out very small, from the beginning, the notion was that they were going to have thousands, if not tens of thousands of students. Within 30 years, roughly 30 to 40 years, you had another interest to begin developing a homegrown population of PhD students. And so the great research universities, the new ones, the sort of startups at the time, Chicago and Stanford being among them, began in the 1890s. Johns Hopkins was the first one of these, with, again, a new mission to emulate the German PhD granting universities. And again, a different model of organization, a much more faculty-centric institution, and a different financing structure. Peter mentioned this, mostly from private philanthropy. Within another 20 or 30 years, you have the dawn of the community colleges, which we haven't mentioned, but which actually served roughly half of the American higher education population. So they had local taxing authority, modeled on sort of school district governance, and were designed to really serve adults, the urban populations that needed job training, and the integration of new immigrants to the country, and so on and so forth. I think right up until the present moment, where we had a burst of experimentation in the early 2000s with online universities, again, very different governance structure, a different mission to serve people sort of with a low-cost convenience model, and new funding, this time coming from the venture capital industry. So I can elaborate on each of those at some length, but I won't do that here. But to me, what it has led to is a sort of ecosystem of institutions that in odd ways wind up supporting each other because they take on innovations in different ways, which then spread through the system. The great example of this is the last one I mentioned, the online institutions in the early 2000s that started to work on how to harness the internet to do online teaching and learning. So that experimentation was largely financed by venture capitalists who were determined to make a lot of money at it. Most of those institutions wound up failing, but what they learned about using the online environment for education was quickly taken up by other institutions. Harvard and MIT started a very successful experiment in this. Other institutions followed suit. So even though most of those experimental institutions in the early 2000s have disappeared, the innovations that they introduced have survived and been taken up now by more traditional institutions. So that's an interesting example of how change, I think, migrates through the system in fairly unexpected ways. I think that, again, I'll echo Peter's comments that a lot of this, I think, is enabled by the fact that we have really no centralized oversight of the American higher education system. We have lots of regulations and almost no policies. It's not even clear what the definition of a university is. It varies from state to state. In some place, the three of us could set up a college tomorrow and call ourselves a university. In other states, there are much more stringent requirements. I have a colleague at Stanford, an eminent scholar named David Laborie, who wrote a book recently called A Perfect Mess, which was his way of describing the American higher education system. And I think it is a very apt description. It is chaotic. It is, frankly, has too great a range of quality. We have some of the best and probably some of the worst in our system, but somehow it manages to work. And I think that for certainly the flagship institutions that we all represent, I think that we are well served by the fact that we have such a differentiated system of education that manages to take on lots of the burdens of educating the populace, and it allows some of the preeminent institutions to focus on what they do best, which is research and the training of very advanced students. So I'll leave it there. I know you're anxious to get to the discussion, but I think we've laid out a lot of basics that should be good food for thought.
Thank you so much, Jeff, for that fascinating set of reflections. And I think several things that you mentioned in the course of your very short set of remarks will inform many of our viewers about some of the big challenges that are facing the world of higher education, not only limited to the United States, but also beyond. I'm going to quickly, go into our Q&A session. So, Peter, my first question to you is that, you have had the privilege of studying and working in some of the world's finest institutions. And you have, of course, traveled around the world and also seen other institutions. Is there a smell test for a world-class university? Like, can you just find out and go to a place and feel, you know what, this is something that is truly world-class, or it's more complex?
Well, that's a very interesting and difficult question to answer. I think the criteria that one would look to in order to determine the quality of an institution, and of course, world class means many different things. One thing it means is attracting students from throughout the world, and that to some extent is a question of advertising, reputational development, and financial assistance. But another has to do with the quality of the faculty and the research that is conducted by that institution. For better and for worse, I think our leading institutions are research institutions, which have to negotiate between the training of young people at the undergraduate level and the training of new scholars and people of technical skills at the graduate level. And so one feature of the smell test would be whether the institution undertakes as a commitment to train the next generation of scholars and of engineers and of practitioners who will dominate the upper levels of their societies over time. Another feature of the smell test would be the extent to which the institution is relatively free. This is a very, very American criterion, and I think would be less prominent in other parts of the world. The extent to which there is an atmosphere of freedom of inquiry and ideological variation and diversity on the faculty and among students. And this is a crisis in the United States today, as I mentioned very briefly in my introductory remarks, because there is a increasing fear that certain types of commitments are going to be uniform in the expression of orthodoxies of one kind or another. So that freedom of inquiry is a very important hallmark of a world-class institution.
Thank you.
Thirdly, and the last thing I'll mention is the freedom of inquiry that is so important in the development of first-class scholars and of the training of undergraduates. There has to be a commitment to that kind of freedom of inquiry rather than the pursuit of orthodoxies of one kind or another.
Well, thank you so much, Peter. You, after all, did carve out ingredients of the smell test. Let me move to Jeff. Jeff, building on what Peter said, it's of course one thing to build universities, and in both your remarks, you talked about the different stakeholders, be it the government, and government's role has been relatively less, and other stakeholders, including, let's say, philanthropists and others. My question to you is that how does the university, in many ways, is somewhat dependent upon these stakeholders, yet is able to retain and assert its own autonomy and remained so independent for so long. And that, I believe, is a very important part of American imagination. And if you could reflect on that, that will be very good.
Well, I think you've put your finger on a really important point, because I agree that the freedom of inquiry, the protection of speech and thought, independence of thought is quite critical. And preserving those buffers are extremely challenging. And I'd say you mentioned two of them, and I'll add another one. I think that in the case of public institutions that have some sponsorship from the government, the legislatures are always wanting to meddle in the affairs of the institution. We're seeing this right now in major ways, with particularly in politicians like the current governor of Florida, who's trying to dictate an awful lot of what's going on in the institutions of the state. There certainly are some formal protections that can be put in place. Many states have independent boards of governance overseeing their institutions, and many state constitutions, there are protections written into the legal status of the institutions that allow them self-governance responsibilities. Those clearly can be pierced if the political winds start blowing in different ways. And so I think that there's a constant need for a constant vigilance in that regard. Philanthropists for the private institutions also feel like they've got the right to not only give us money, but also tell us what to do with that money. There's some very celebrated cases where institutions have felt that philanthropists just went too far, and in some cases have decided they needed to return the money rather than follow the dictates of the donor. The other one that has sort of emerged, echoing again on the last part of my remarks, are in areas in which there's a for-profit structure and the investors want to have a lot of say over what's going on. And this has become a particular challenge because they're not only interested in the academic mission, but also in the bottom line. I think there's no easy answer to this. I think in every case, it's really a shared understanding of the ideal of the academic mission, which is that it depends critically on freedom of inquiry, as Peter mentioned. It is a shared cultural expectation. It's a little bit like what we're finding about democracy in this country these days, that you can write all the laws and regulations you want to, but ultimately it depends on people respecting those rules and regulations for them to have any effect. So I believe that I share Peter's concerns that maybe this is the new looming crisis in American higher education, and it is generated by the fact that the public in general is less trusting of the faculty, is less trusting of the kind of conversations that are going on university campuses, and is beginning to exert a greater desire to have some say in all of this. I don't know that there's any ironclad guarantee that we're going to come out of this okay. I think that there is a genuine risk that some of the freedoms that we've counted on are going to be eroded as we go forward.
Thank you so much, Jeff, for that. I think I do share the point about the kind of internal and external risks that universities face, and that it's not only limited to United States, but also other parts of the world as well. Peter, let me move into some of the more internal dynamics and governance of universities, especially in the United States. For a very long time, as you mentioned, the Humboldtian model of research university was influenced United States from Germany. My question to you is that how does the balance between teaching and research shapes the ideas of a world-class university? And I want you to speak from your own experience. In some ways, my question is that universities around the world, including in India, are trying to become better and are even aspiring, some of them, to be truly world-class. But we know that world-class universities are ones which are able to, A, contribute at the highest levels in teaching, and B, is able to also do research. Now, we also know that internally that requires a fair amount of balancing, because teaching requires individual faculty members to take responsibility and be available for the students and to engage with them. And research requires maybe actually sometimes being not in a classroom or not in a university and actually end up doing thinking, and if you're doing field work, being out in the field and writing. How does a world-class university balance these two equally important objectives?
Well, as you might imagine, there's no simple answer to this balance, and different institutions are going to strike the balance in different ways. One crisis, which I think is related, I'll mention the connection in just a moment, that we haven't mentioned is the cost of higher education, which is really soaring in the United States, particularly among the more elite universities, but also in connection with the less prestigious and well-established institutions, and even community colleges and the local ones. The ability to conduct research depends upon the nature of the laboratories that are available, the quality of the research that's conducted, the atmosphere of freedom of inquiry that is necessary, links among the different institutions, where collaborative work is very important and increasingly shaping the research agendas of different institutions, and how those different factors balance out is really pretty much unique to each institution. And I don't think I have any kind of formula, nor does anybody else, for how to do that. But it is a constant struggle. And again, I want to emphasize what I think we neglected in our earlier remarks: the cost factor, the incredibly difficult question of how students can be educated at these, especially these elite institutions, at a cost that they can afford. This is particularly true in the United States, where the people who attend institutions are expected to finance their own education largely on their own, and they simply can't do it without a lot of help. And so there's a real political struggle in the United States now about student loans, and whether the system of student loans, which has been in crisis, as I've written in an article, can be sustained, and whether loans are going to have to be forgiven given the extraordinarily burdensome debt burdens that many students are involved in.
Thank you very much, Peter, for that. I think this is, in fact, I was planning to bring the discussion surrounding cost a little later, but I will get back on that. But let me move to Jeff. Jeff, one of the things that I want to spend some time is in relation to the expectations from the job market as to what universities should be doing. And we all know, having been in universities, that faculty members and the scholars and those of us who run the university, we have a view as to what we ought to be teaching our students. And that's based upon our informed knowledge and understanding as to what each degree course or each set of curriculum should be. And then we come to a stage where the students are about to be graduating, and then they graduate and they go out. And then you hear from all these people outside the university saying, oh, you know what, we have to reskill these people. They have all these degrees, but they simply are not suitable for work. And they are increasingly pushing the boundaries as to what universities ought to be doing. What kind of lessons that countries like India can learn from the experiences of world-class universities in the United States?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think it is certainly a tension, and I think we see it even in elite universities. At Stanford right now, the most popular courses, the most popular majors are computer science. 20 years ago they were economics, and 20 years before that they were psychology, probably. So we're seeing this shift toward things that are perceived, at least, as being of more practical value. Although I would argue the tension's been there for a long time. I think there's some ironies here. So one thing is, although the public in general believes that what the job market is hungry for is more and more technical training, if you actually look at what employers say they want, the list includes things like creativity and resilience and problem-solving abilities, things, the so-called soft skills that actually aren't all about knowing a precise skill or a precise job task. So one answer is that we've done a very bad job of arguing in favor of the things that we probably do best, which is to encourage students to be independent thinkers and good problem solvers, and that actually has a high value in the job market. I think we've sort of lost that rhetorical battle, and that's a problem for colleges and universities, because increasingly they're being asked to defend what they do in these more sort of instrumental ways. I think the second answer is that this pressure is likely going to lead to continued diversification, because I frankly don't think research universities are very good places to learn job skills. We can't keep pace with the change. We can't build up faculties and develop new curricula and research models at the same rate that the job market is changing, and we're just not designed to do that. And I think that trying to play that game is probably going to be fatal to a lot of things that we value about research universities. But in keeping with the earlier remarks that we both made, I think that the possibility for greater diversification and specialization means that there should be places for students to go who really want to focus on just those skills and not kind of more rounded education. I think this is a tough, the cost factor certainly comes into this. I think it's a tough value proposition for universities to make in a world in which people increasingly want to see a return on their money right away. But I think we have to continue because I think if we turn great colleges and universities into simply vocational preparation shops, they will cease to contribute the value that we actually expect of them.
Thank you very much, Jeff. That was very, very useful, especially because this is the kind of conundrum that we are dealing with in India as well. Peter, I want to bring your attention to something that you may or may not have seen. A Harvard economist by name Raj Shetty, in some 14 different charts, has identified through big data the story of opportunity and mobility in the United States. And of course, he has made a number of conclusions to that, and it's been a very compelling part of the discussions around the world. And his fundamental argument is somewhat in the lines that the chances of making it, let's say, from a childhood in poverty to an adulthood in affluence is much lesser in the United States than other nations, including, he talks about Canada. And then he makes several other conclusions about issues surrounding inequality, whereby the correlation between the incomes of parents and the incomes of children will have, as adults, in other words, is strongly inherited, and the so-called intergenerational mobility is actually has been flat for decades. And he has given data surrounding it. My question is, and the reason I asked this question is that in India, higher education is seen as the most important and almost inevitable basis for opportunity and social mobility. And I have always believed that that could be the case with the United States too. What are your reflections about from both your experiences and your own interest in this subject?
Well, this is a very important question, and I'm glad you mentioned the research of Raj Shetty, because he has confirmed what some other scholars had increasingly established, which was that intergenerational mobility in the United States is no longer the leader in the world, but is actually no greater now than the average in the G20. So that's a serious problem, and I think our research universities are not in a very good position to address that problem. I think it's primarily a problem of family stability well before the child reaches college age, and of elementary and secondary educational institutions. The one important development is, which you alluded to, is the development of what is called CTE, career, trade, and I forget what the E is for, but it's focused on the teaching of skills that are not necessarily academic skills so much as they are job-oriented skills, such that there are many students who cannot benefit so much from a college or university education, but will still be able to gain some additional training in areas where they can develop job skills and mobility skills in their own institutions, and that's, I think, going to be an increasingly important element of our overall educational structure, as universities are not well equipped to do this, and as high schools are also find themselves in a limited capacity to develop the necessary skills in all of their students for higher education in the conventional sense. So CTE is going to be increasingly...
It's career technical education. Yeah, you mentioned CT, career technical education. Yeah. Go ahead, Peter. You're finishing something. Yeah.
So I just think that that's a very rich set of opportunities for our educational system to pursue, and I'm not sure that our existing elite institutions, world-class institutions, are in to do that. I think it's going to have to do much more with the role of employers, potential employers, and high schools that can train young people for careers that do not require a college degree.
Thank you so much, Peter. For all the viewers who are watching this program, I have sent it in the chat box, and it will be transferred to the YouTube as well, an article and the work of Raj Shetty focusing on social mobility and equality of opportunity in this the project that he's been undertaking for many years. Jeff, let me kind of slightly shift gears and ask you a question about, in some ways, one of the remarkable things about the American imagination for higher education is the fact that it is an aspiration for students around the world to pursue education there. And this has a lot to do with the ecosystem of learning and openness that it has been the case for a very long time. But it also ended up becoming a situation where international students were part of the financial governance of universities in the United States and even other parts of the Western world. My question to you is that through the pandemic years, and now we hope we are entering into a post-pandemic world, has the thinking relating to dependence on international students and internationalization through students, especially fee-paying students, has given way to newer ideas, whereby opportunities for collaborations with universities around the world can transcend the possibilities for only students coming to the United States for studying and then not necessarily looking at institutions beyond that?
Sure. I think, again, that this is a story that begins back in history in some ways. And I always back up a few decades to think about where we are today. I think, we inherited from the great medieval universities a strong sense of internationalization. The Oxford and Paris and Bologna were magnets for talent from all over the European world anyway, from the very beginning. The very first person to earn a PhD from the University of Chicago in the early 1890s was a student from Japan. So this is not a new phenomenon. Excuse me just a minute. But the character of it has changed, and I think you're right that in probably about 20 years ago, a lot of institutions began to depend on the foreign student market because it actually added a lot of tuition revenue. International students were presumed not to be eligible for the same kind of financial aid that American students get, and so as full fee-paying students, they were very lucrative. I know a fair number of presidents of small colleges that managed to stay afloat by attracting students from the Middle East or China and would tap into a market there and protect it quite vigorously as a way of subsidizing the institution. I think those days are probably coming to an end. I think that the combination of COVID and frankly, the political environment in the US has made a lot of international students a little bit more wary of coming to the US. So I think that it has had a couple of effects. I think one is that at the elite institutions, there's a growing interest in trying to treat international students from a financial standpoint the same as American students. So that means essentially need-blind financial aid, trying to remove cost as an issue. That also has the effect of hopefully diversifying the economic profile of international students, so you're not just getting students from the wealthiest families who are coming over. This is a tall order, and I think that not all institutions are going to be able to do it at the same pace, but I do think there's a growing commitment that if we are going to be truly international institutions, this is what we ought to do. Now, you're asking about sort of the export function. To what extent can we take our programs to where the students are rather than expect them to come to the US. And, we're all familiar, I think, with some of the more ambitious experiments, NYU in Abu Dhabi and elsewhere, Yale's collaboration with NUS. I think that, at least from Stanford's standpoint, I think that there is less enthusiasm about trying to do this because I think there's a sense that it dilutes the experience that students have by being at Stanford. So far, I don't see a great movement or a sort of large scale movement in this direction. I think that people are still watching these experiments, and of course, some of them have failed. I think a number of institutions tried to set up shop in China and it didn't work. I do know that India, through its new education policy, is trying to be more inviting to foreign institutions, and I think that that's going to be a very tempting market for a lot of reasons. You have a large English-speaking student population. If you've got a government structure that is very open and accommodating, I think that's going to be quite attractive for a number of institutions. But I think we've also learned that it's a very big lift. It's a hard thing to do. It's expensive. And so I think that unless there's a truly strong sort of academic mission that is motivating this kind of thing, my guess is that they're going to still be few and far between as experiments.
Thank you, Jeff. I think I share your viewpoint on this. Basically, and when I talked about that, I didn't mean the idea of brick and mortar campuses, but forms of collaborations that could mean that students are able to engage in different ways. Listen, we are coming into the end of the program. So, but I'm going to take a few. We have another 6-7 minutes. There are some audience questions. So, Peter, there are a lot of questions. I'm going to take a few. One of the questions, Peter, is about the fact that how can Indian institutions do more things to collaborate with US universities. What is it that would take for, say, good American universities to build collaborations, not the kind of brick and mortar campuses, but programs and opportunities that will allow students to interact with each other?
Well, that's a very easy question to answer because you, Raj Kumar, embody that effort. The Indian universities could very much advance this objective by following what you have done, doing precisely that, to develop collaborative relationships among Indian institutions and American institutions that do not involve necessarily moving a lot of students back and forth and do not involve enormous costs. I was going to, you really are the best example of that approach in your memoranda of understandings that you have concluded with so many different institutions in the United States. I just want to make one other quick point because it related to the discussion that just preceded this. Another development in American higher education is, which in some ways cuts across and against the spending of money to bring a lot of foreign students to American campuses, is the incredible arms race that is occurring with American institutions to build more athletic facilities, to build new campuses, to enrich the offerings in American institutions, which require a lot of resources that might otherwise be devoted to the international commitments. So it's just an incredible set of investments for American institutions that compete in a real sense with these other laudable objectives.
Thank you very much, Peter, for that. Jeff, there's one last question for you. Jeff, this is about the idea of regulation and governance of universities. The national education policy in India, but also other countries are all battling with it. Historically, one could argue that Indian universities were over-regulated and under-governed, but the national education policy and the policy relating to institution of eminence, all of which has dynamically and dramatically given a new imagination for Indian higher education. Is there anything that we can learn from the American experience with regard to what kind of regulation suits the development of an ecosystem for promoting excellence?
Well, I think most people on American university campuses would say less is better when it comes to regulation. Of course, we all want to be allowed to be as free as possible. I think the U.S. government has intervened in very selective ways. So there are certain policies that have had a big influence on campus life. One that many of your audience will be familiar with is called Title IX, which is attempting to guarantee gender equity in everything from treatment in the classroom to treatment on athletic fields. So that's a place where there are mountains of regulations and rules, and a great deal of effort has been devoted to try to meet the responsibilities under those regulations. But under the sort of the bigger picture issues, like, what should be taught, who should be taught it, who should be admitted to college, those things have been left largely to the individual decisions of institutions. And I think that we're pretty firmly committed to the notion that has contributed to excellence in general. And there's a great deal of resistance to any effort to encroach on those areas of academic freedom.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Peter Schuck, as well as Dr. Geoffrey Cox. What an extraordinary set of reflections that both of you have shared with us on the theme, building world-class universities, the American imagination for higher education. It is only fair to say that the extraordinary export of the idea of American higher education has inspired so many institutions around the world. Generations of students from around the world have benefited immensely by studying in leading American institutions and also ended up becoming scholars in these institutions. The vision and imagination of the establishment and evolution of the leading American education institutions is something that institutions around the world are looking with a lot of sense of curiosity and appreciation. What Peter and Jeff did in the last 1 hour is so instructive, not only for all of us in India to appreciate the journey, but also understand the challenges and the complexities of the governance of these institutions even today. An established higher education system like the United States is also facing several challenges that we are facing in India. I want to take this moment to thank Peter and Jeff for sharing their valuable time with us and also those wonderful reflections. Thank you to both of you, and appreciate your comments and your reflections. Thank you to all of you who are watching this program. We'll take a short break, and the next thematic session will begin in 15 minutes on the theme, Bridging the Gender Digital Divide, Improving the Participation of Women in Higher Education. We will have academics from Brazil, from India, and of course, from our own university as well. Thank you to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Raj.